Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined again today by my friend and colleague Josh Blank, Director of Research for the Texas Politics Project. With a week to go to Election Day, Josh, have you voted?
I voted this morning. I woke up and I saw that it was freezing in Austin and it was raining, and I thought, this is a good time to go vote, and I was correct.
Even though the research is supposed to show that, right, that it's less than a point reduction in turnout overall, bad weather on Election Day. Isn't that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, that's true. The weather impact on elections is relatively small, but that's on the aggregate. We're not talking about Austin in particular. It says nothing about Austin, and I know how Austinites are about cold, rain, any sort of mildly bad weather. Yeah, like if it was overcast, there might be a shorter line. So,
right, well,
yeah, no.
I'm glad you got that knocked out and did your bit for democracy. So, speaking of elections, we thought that today we would, rather than dwell on a drill down into one big topic, although in some ways maybe one could see this way, that we'd talk about a few things that are out in the ether. We probably won't podcast again before the election. I think currently we're slated to record for Election Day, but we're going to try to put that off by a couple days so that we're not in that dead zone of recording something on Election Day and it being all anticipation and no results. And who needs that?
Yeah. And also the gunshots and the gunshots.
Right, yes.
And
the civil unrest.
Just kidding. Right.
Yeah, just kidding. Just joking about civil unrest and the collapse of democracy today, which we don't think is going to happen. I don't anyway.
Very unlikely.
Perhaps we could get to that. Very unlikely, exactly. So we thought we'd hit on a few of the topics that, frankly, we're hearing about from press and reading about out there and getting asked about, and that are just generally hovering over the election. And so, with an emphasis on what we're seeing in polling, but also what that tells us about the dynamics in the election. So we thought we'd start today by talking about independence. And we did a blog post last week that decomposed independence in Texas to the nth degree, with a setup that we've talked about on the podcast before. The fact that as Texas is undeniably, I think, becoming more politically competitive between the parties, and you'll note that I did not say as Texas is turning whatever color, but that as the state becomes more independent, that the just by the virtue of the math, independents are becoming more important, and as they're becoming important, they look a little bit different in this election cycle.
Yeah, that's right. And I think just to quickly lay it out, ultimately, I think you're right. And what's funny, we've sort of joked for years. I could actually, saying this, but we've actually joked for years about how unimportant independents are. And it's not really a joke. It was more of a fact, actually, than a joke, because
the joke is how determined you were about it and how foul your affect was. Well, let's just to bring that out.
Sure. Well,
about independence.
Right. And this is, again, we sort of set this up as, these are some of the things that we're getting asked about. We used to get asked about independents all the time. There was sort of this rote idea of like, well, what do independents think? Because independents are going to decide the election. And we'd have to say, well, not in Texas, because in Texas, Republicans generally started with about a 10-point advantage, and independents, for the most part, broke towards Republican candidates and Republican issues in general. So when you look at the attitudes of independents, and what we're talking about when we talk about independents is we're talking about the approximately about 10% of the electorate that refuses to identify with either party, even having been asked twice, both whether they identify with the party and then even if they say no, whether they lean towards the party. And ultimately, this group is, as we've said, it's written. They're defined kind of by their lack of engagement, their lack of interest. If you're one of those political independents who is really just super engaged, and that's why you're independent, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the rest of the independents who aren't paying attention and who vacillate between positions and priorities and things like that. But ultimately, again, if the parties are, if this is a competitive state, what that basically means in simple terms is that both parties can mobilize roughly similar numbers of voters for statewide elections. That's what we're talking about. So then ultimately the attitudes of these independents become so important. The interesting that happened in our most recent polling that's really, I think, very interesting when people ask me now, hey, what should I be looking at? What's interesting right now? This is one of the things I go to right away, which is that if you look at pretty much all of our polling up until 2018, and you look at our election polling, independents universally favored the Republican candidate in contests for president, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, for Senate races, for congressional trial ballots, for the Texas House, without fail. In 2018, that was true, except for the Senate race, in which case a majority of independents favored Beto O'Rourke over Ted Cruz. I think ultimately this contributed probably to that narrower margin. And when I say that narrower margin, I'm not just talking about the 2.5 point Cruz win, but I'm talking about the 2.5 point Cruz win relative to, the more like 5 point wins of people like the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, kind of in that second range of candidates.
The attorney general won that race, right?
Yeah, I think so. He's still
okay. Yeah,
he was he indicted
by a bit? Yeah.
Anyway, okay, but anyway, so. That was sort of a big shift in that race. And I think that was one of the big factors leading to a closer race than the others. What's interesting in our most recent polling now, again, that, is having seen independents universally support Republican candidates, is that in this survey, independents preferred Joe Biden over Donald Trump. They preferred MJ Hagar over John Cornyn, and they preferred Democrats on the congressional trial ballot. They preferred Democrats on the text ledge trial ballot for Texas House. And this is a pretty big shift. Doesn't indicate a permanent shift, and I want to make that clear. I don't think this means that all of a sudden independents are now Texas Democrats. But what it shows is that, one, it's possible, and also I think it's a further reflection of the competition we're seeing in Texas.
Well, and I think you probably think I go a bridge too far with this, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is that I think it's also a function of the nature of independents that their attitudes as a group are just going to be less fixed, and so it seems plausible to me that you have as a group independents. There's going to be some significant subset of independents who don't pay a lot of attention to politics, are absorbing some of the negative affect towards incumbent institutions, not necessarily incumbent candidates, although maybe, and found some appeal in Donald Trump's particular celebrity, his lack of political experience, his outsider campaign, etc. Now Trump is a known quantity. There's a lot of negative information about him in the ether. And there's no partisanship to prevent them from changing their minds.
I've been thinking about this in a similar way, but maybe slightly differently, which is I'm thinking about the role of rejection among independents. Ultimately, you're an independent, you reject the parties. It seems to me that if you reject both parties, you have more incentive to reject the party in power than the party out of power.
Yeah.
And so I think that is, so I agree with you. And I think more about the idea of, again, what are they rejecting right now? What they seem to be rejecting is Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus. Yeah. So we saw this in our polling, but it's also, it's coming up pretty consistently in most other polling as well, this independent preference for Democrats.
And as I remember, it's not independent approval numbers of Biden are not.
No, he's less bad.
Yeah, are not stellar. So it's, so there's something, I think there's a certain, there's a bit more, I jokingly use derogatory terms that I won't use at this time, but, there's a more fluidity in independence evaluations of political figures and partisan figures that makes them unpredictable as a group. And to the extent that we're now looking at them as perhaps a linchpin. Let me ask you this before we move on to the next thing. Yeah. And this is just a math problem that we should do off mic, but because I love doing math thing today. I'm feeling super warmed up. So
if I was to say to you, do math problems in podcasts?
I don't think we did. I know it's really, I have a chalk in my hand. I really don't. But if you think about what the back of the envelope math does, you look at, we think about turnout tendencies among independents. It's funny to me that we did that blog post and there's not in the end something that says, and so this shift looks like this percent.
Well, in our defense, there's a table.
I've been saying 2 to 4.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it depends. And here's the thing, if we've been watching the early voting numbers really carefully. And, the thing that's kind of notable so far in those numbers is the parity between, clearly Democratic and clearly Republican voters, by which all I mean by that is voters who have a consistent Democratic or a consistent Republican primary voting history. We know that you voted in these races. Ultimately, if you're someone who shows up for midterm primaries, as well as presidential primaries, you're probably a member of that party. We've seen rough parity, but that's kind of why, in some ways, the group that we don't know about, that's basically the other third, of the early vote electorate right now, is kind of unknown to us. And that's why I think these numbers are so interesting, right? But I agree, like independence as a whole, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a shift of maybe, 1 to 3 points in Biden's favor. But ultimately, the question is, are you talking about from a baseline of +9 for Trump, or are you talking about a baseline of +2.5 for the Republican at the top of the ticket? Because that makes a pretty big difference. Now, it's not the latter. It's not the latter because the latter, again, there's already a shift in place, right? Right.
In other words, if you just looking at our polling, which now is a few weeks old, but we're going to talk about the polling, maybe the polling in the last few days. Yeah, I mean, but it's baked into the movement from say 9 down to 4 or 5.
Yeah.
But there's still, but that's where the unpredictability of independence comes in, because some of those independents are, more than partisans are landing with some of the third party candidates, and there's still low single digits of them undecided, and they could all, there could be a lot of movement still, or at least some.
And I would say, as we talk about this, I think there's an argument to be made that, the movement might even be bigger, because ultimately, what we're talking about is a detached group of people, of whom some of them are going to show up, right? So you're not usually someone who's detached from politics, but also a consistent voter. So we don't know who's going to show up. But if we think about who's likely to show up, it's probably, again, the people with stronger feelings of rejection towards whatever's going on right now, I think on average are more likely to turn out than those who just kind of reject the whole thing, who don't like Biden, who don't like Trump.
We need to put that on the writing list, the rejectionist independent hypothesis.
We can work on that.
I like it.
But I mean, I promise this will transition into the next one, I think, but I think, but the ultimate thing right now is, because we're seeing such a competitive state, we are talking about these kinds of margins. We're talking about, does Joe Biden do a couple, does he shift the final outcome by a couple points because independents have rejected Trump? Does he shift the final outcome by a point or two because of, what turnout looks like in the suburbs, right?
Right.
Does he shift it because of how he does with Hispanics, or how he doesn't do with Hispanics? Does he not shift it as much? And these are the sorts of, ultimately, when you're talking about, again, a competitive race, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about, 1 and 2 point shifts amongst groups, really, in a state like Texas.
And what we're talking about today actually is, a few of those groups where those 1 or 2 points might be coming out. So let's talk about Hispanics. So this will give us a way of talking a little bit about the polling in the last few days. So just to recap, most people that if you've made your way to listening to this, you probably know that since Sunday, there have been 4 polls released that collected data within the space of a couple weeks in the range of, I don't have it right in front of me, something between the 13th of October to about the 24th, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it depends on what you want to include in that list, but anywhere from the 11th to the 13th to the 20th to the 25th. So over about a 2-week period, 10-day period. And
they found pretty widely divergent results among Hispanics. They found pretty widely divergent results, although not as wide as among Hispanics. There was a spread at the top lines that we can talk about, but let's start with talking about Hispanics, because there was a big spread in the results on Hispanic preferences in the presidential race, which fed a very active and ongoing debate, which we talked a little bit about a few weeks ago with Mark Jones.
Yeah, this is one of those things that, I don't think, it'd be too strong to say it drives me crazy, because not a lot drives me crazy. This is probably too strong, but
it agitates you.
I guess I've
seen you agitated about this.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. I think what it is that, so we go and we have some polls come out, and then all of a sudden, you start to see some tweets, and the tweets are like, you won't believe in this new poll, Joe Biden is only capturing the support of fill in the blank, 59% of Hispanics, 65% of Hispanics, 52% of Hispanics, whatever, right? Now, that doesn't mean that Donald Trump's
But consistently more than half.
Consistently more than half, but then the other side is, Trump is, not hemorrhaging support among Hispanics, or Trump is doing well enough among Hispanics to keep competitive taxes competitive. And the thing about these sort of, again, these exclamations of surprise is that it's not based on anything. I mean, we've been conducting polling here for a decade, and one of the things that's sort of striking
is based on something.
Well, yeah, that's right. It's based on not knowing what you're talking about. So, I mean, we've been doing these polls here for a decade. We've been watching other people's polls here, for at least that long. And, and I always say this, without fail, there's a floor of 30% of, I think the Hispanic registered voter pool generally over this decade. And again, that could be shifting, right? But right now, who support Republicans? They support Republican policies. They support Republican candidates. They, for all intents and purposes,
identify as Republicans,
are Republican voters. And the truth is, I mean, this could get even more complicated because I like that kind of thing. But I mean, the question is, are we talking about people who identify as Hispanic, or what if we ask people after they identify as white or something else, whether they're Hispanic? Because then it even looks more conservative, that electorate, actually, if you expand or, make, I don't even know.
Which in that particular scenario makes a lot of sense. But
right. But ultimately, this is the case here. And so I think, these expectations that especially Democrats seem to have are just not based in reality. And I think, what I always think is it seems as though Democrats seem to believe or want to believe that Texas Hispanics are going to be a group that votes for Democrats, maybe not at the rates that African Americans do, but maybe close, right? So if African Americans go for Democrats, 9-1 or more, right, so 90% plus, there's this idea that Hispanics should be a 70 or 80% Democratic group, and that's just not the case. And really, what makes one of the factors, along with independents that we just discussed, that'll make an election more or less competitive in Texas, kind of comes down to, do Republicans get 30, 35, 40, 45% of the Hispanic vote? Because I mean, one of the things that people made a big deal out of at the time in 2014, when Abbott won by 20 points over Wendy Davis, was according to exit polling, which has a very wide margin of error, but gives us a sense. The exit polling said that he received the support of 45% of Hispanics. Now that might sound crazy, except he won by 20 points. So it's not that crazy. And that's the thing I think that people sort of fail to appreciate, is that the competition over the Hispanic electorate in Texas is a lot more fierce, I think, than people realize, at least outside the state.
Yeah, I think it's yet another aspect of politics in Texas, and it's obviously wrapped up in the partisan, discussion of partisan competition, where the narratives that people want to embrace, or people want to embrace narratives that just don't admit of a lot of subtlety.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds yeah.
It may be that, your preconceptions about, Hispanic voting behavior, the ideological context and the cultural context of Hispanics needs a little more subtlety injected into it than you're willing to bring to the table. And look, I that's going to sound like, we're picking on the Democrats, frankly. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also true of Republicans who often are just like, well, Hispanics are,
socially conservative.
This is only a slight exaggeration of Hispanics are a conservative people. And I'm like, just easy, because they're Catholic.
Was that when you say, hey, by the way, Hispanics aren't a people?
Yeah, for example.
For example.
And I think that those who point out that a lot of the polling of Hispanics is very tentative, and that they're a hard to reach population in a lot of cases, that a lot of our samples are small. I mean, the argument's kind of being made, frankly, most recently by Beto O'Rourke in his critique of all polling. It would seem that he says is underestimating Democratic turnout. I would say, A, in this circumstance, maybe.
Yeah.
But B, the assumptions about Hispanic political behavior and Hispanic political identification, require more research and are yet to be demonstrated, to be as clear as people make it out to be.
Well, and I mean, ultimately, where it needs to be demonstrated for Beto O'Rourke is it needs to be demonstrated in an actual election, not in your perception of how things might be going on the ground, that it's not getting reflected in polling. We'll get to the difficulty of that, I think. But maybe we should cover a couple more topics before we talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other, so then the other thing that is coming up other than the Hispanic political behavior and probably more directly polling of Hispanics is what's going on in the suburbs. It seems like you can't really, and there's a good reason for this, you can't really write a story about the 2020 election right now without making some reference to the suburbs. Now, part of this is completely justified because at the presidential level, sure, but particularly in Texas, but in a lot of other places of the country, the suburban and exurban areas that, around major urban areas are ground zero for much of the political conflict, and for the most, and certainly in Texas for the most competitive races in Congress and in the state legislature, because of what is part of the debate. I mean, it seems to me this oversimplifies, having just vilified people for oversimplifying. I'm going to oversimplify, but only for the sake of explanation. That on one hand, there's a narrative that says, this is mainly because conservative and Republican suburbanites are abandoning Donald Trump in droves. And on the other side, that the demographics, that might be a little bit of a straw man, but and on the other side, the fact that the demographics of the suburbs are changing, and so that is affecting these races, and that is percolating up to some degree and affecting the statewide and at that level national races as well. I think I don't want to completely dismiss the abandoning of Donald Trump, but we're not seeing any evidence that that's happening in droves.
Oh, yeah, and I want to add one more thing to your list, actually. And the other piece I'd add to it is that, what the suburbs have going for them are two things that make them, an object of attention within the state. I think what you're talking about definitely makes it an object of attention beyond, within the state and beyond in terms of the congressional districts and things like that.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that, the suburbs are, whereas, the rural parts of the state are overwhelmingly Republican, and the urban, so the urban cores, are where the Democrats are going to get the lion's share of their vote. The suburbs are a very high turnout and competitive part of the state.
And
so that's
a lot of votes.
Yeah, it's about probably about a third of the electorate, but also is competitive, and they turn out at these very high rates. And so ultimately, this is something that, you would expect partisans to be competing over, because it is really where a lot of the competition is. It's where you're going to move margins. I mean, in rural parts of the state, Republicans are talking about, if you can think, Beto O'Rourke did his 54 county tour. Ultimately, how many votes did that net him in the rural parts of the state? Not many, because there aren't that many votes for Democrats. Republicans are going to do their best to mobilize all the votes they can in the rural parts of the states. Democrats are going to do the same thing in the urban core, and it's in the suburbs where the fights really are going to take place to kind of define the race, and where really a lot of the money is going to be spent. But anyway, I mean, you're right. And the main thing here about the suburbs that's sort of, I think is most interesting is that it's all these things in some ways, right? I mean, it's both, these sort of high rates, but the other thing is, if you've been following Texas politics for years or some amount of time, or even just this kind of stuff generally, Texas's suburbs have been some of the fastest growing places in the country. And for the most part, the fast growth is not due to people moving from California or New York or wherever. It's people moving from other parts of the state, and it's younger Texans. It's people moving to be in and around the urban core, but who can't afford to live in the urban core. And so this is where, again, we're in Austin. You can look at sort of the growth of Cedar Park and Leander and places like that. And ultimately, if you look at the places that are growing so much, these are also overlapping with the congressional districts that are now being fought over, which were drawn 10 years ago when a lot of these places were significantly less populated. And so you're talking about places that are significantly more populated, and they're populated with younger and more diverse Texans. And so it's a different suburb. And that goes back to your first point, which is, I think a lot of people, when they started to see more competition in Texas congressional districts, were real quick to say, oh, suburban Republicans are leaving Donald Trump. Well, there's no polling evidence for that. And in particular, the particular instantiation of this was, suburban women are leaving Trump. And I think, implied when people would say that was, suburban white women. That's what we're talking about. And honestly, if you're talking about the aspect of the conservative or of the suburbs that are making it more competitive, it's not older white women. It's younger non-white women. It's younger non-white men That's what you're talking about. You're talking about a young, diverse Texas that is expanding these urban corridors and making these places more competitive.
And probably, and also I think with a dollop of younger college educated white people, right? That are, those are some of the people that are leaving those urban cores
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, yeah, that's right too. So, I mean, if you're a younger person who was, white or non-white, doesn't really matter, but like a younger college educated person working in the urban core renting, and you decide that you're at a point where you're ready to buy, you're not buying where you're renting right now. And that's true almost anywhere in Texas in the major cities. And so that is pushing you into these areas, but it's also pushing you from being represented by Lloyd Doggett, Democrat, right, whose district runs from Austin to San Antonio, to maybe living in Roger Williams' district or Mike McCall's district that's going to run from the suburbs of Houston out Chip Roy. Well, Chip Roy's, that's an interesting district. It's a little far,
but
it could be a San Antonio suburb. I'm not as familiar with the San Antonio geography to say so. But that's
there's enough that there's Austinites in that district.
That's true.
Yeah, plenty. So I think the only thing, that kind of elaborates the two ideal points that I was caricaturing. But the other thing that I would also add to that in terms of the fascination with the suburbs and the sense of surprise and the sometimes more intuitive rather than data-based assessments of this is that, if you think back to the good analyses of the rise of the Republican Party in Texas, that started, it didn't all start, but it really took hold in the suburbs.
In Dallas suburbs. And
the suburbs were ground zero, were the petri dish in which Republican hegemony germinated over, the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so I think there's also just a sense of like, as you say, that was Republican. The suburbs in most places were Republican territory for a long time. And the fact that they're changing, I think people are grappling for an explanation.
Well, and one thing I think that's really, and I love that you brought that up because I bring this up with people who care. And now just to really smash away your caricatures, one more, with that, I think there is a fundamental difference to that change from a Democratic control state to a Republican control state that began in the suburbs and the change that we're seeing now to a more competitive state from a Republican dominated state. And the difference was that, if you follow that history, is that when the suburbs were growing in Texas and becoming Republican strongholds, that was people leaving the city. That was part of the white flight. That was a rejection of the urban in a lot of ways and movement towards a much more homogenous, socioeconomically, certainly racially, communities, right? What we're talking about now is completely different. We're talking about people coming from other parts of the state who are young, diverse, more likely to be college educated, and they're moving as close to the city as they can afford. And that's a very different sense of place. It's a different movement of people, I think. And that's sort of what we're experiencing right now.
And as they're doing that, they're not changing parties. Right. Which, in the initial growth of the Republican Party, there was a lot of party switching going on. And it, really, the big catalyst or the big watershed really is when Reagan runs for president in 1980 and they win Texas. And there's, there's still some stop and start because the Republicans, the Democrats mount lots of rearguard actions. But, you're really on the road to the Texas of the first two decades of the 21st century at that point. And it's really that the suburbs are really a huge engine for that, along with, where Republicans still have urban strongholds like parts of Houston, parts of Dallas, et cetera. All of this brings us then for just the last couple of minutes to focus a little bit on the early voting number and how we should not caricature that. I still think the ideal type caricatures of people's interpretations is useful before you decompose them.
Yeah, let me give you
That's just my method,
So, a question that I've been, I've answered a couple times today was, people sort of, reporters, I shouldn't say, not like just random people.
Not real people.
Well, they're real.
You're not talking to real people.
Well, not like ordinary people. People who choose to be reporters, who I love. Anyway, been talking to reporters today about the early vote number. There's been a lot of intrigue in the sense that if you kind of look at, like, I think on the New York Times today, there was an article with a nice data visualization that showed that Texas has the most votes cast so far of any state. Okay. And people are kind of surprised by this because they know that Texas is a low turnout state, but also it's a big state, and people are sort of interpreting this to mean, well, if there's high turnout, this must be good for Democrats. Now, I think earlier in the podcast, we said, well, the actual underlying numbers are not so positive, I would say, based on what we know so far for Democrats. I mean, it certainly looks competitive, but we'll see. But the bigger thing here is just to point out, there's a reason that Texas has such a high early vote number relative to other states. And the main reason is the fact that there's not many other ways to vote here. Texas is one of 5 states that did not extend mail-in voting. And because of the way that elections are run in the U.S., basically every state has its own set of rules for how they're going to handle those mail-in ballots, which means that at this point in the process, we can't really compare how many mail-in ballots, let's say, Texas has had compared to California, compared to Nevada, compared to somewhere else, because in some states they can't even touch the mail-in ballots until, election day or the day after or whatever. So we're comparing in-person votes. Well, Texas has had an extra week of early voting. So we've had, we're on our 3rd week of early voting, and a lot of states do not have that. And there's no other way to vote safely if you're concerned about the coronavirus pandemic and you don't want to vote on election day for most people, unless you're over the age of 65, you have a disability that's not related to the coronavirus, indirectly, I guess, or you're not going to be in the county. The 3 ways you can vote by mail here. And so it's a little bit of I wouldn't even say, it's an apples to oranges comparison right now, number one. But number two, the other thing that I kind of keep reminding people about is if turnout is way up in Texas, turnout's probably going to be way up everywhere. And I have these conversations with people all the time. Like, there's nothing about this election that makes Texans specifically excited. People bring this up about young voters. Say, well, are young voters going to decide this election? And I say, well, look, if young voters turn out at a really high rate, I kind of suspect that everybody turned out at a really high rate.
Yes.
And therefore their weight, on the outcome is going to be, not inconsequential, but it's going to be minimal relative to their increase in turnout. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. I think there's a lot of excitement, or not excitement. There's a lot of interest.
Well, there's a lot of intensity.
A lot of intensity, right. Right. And so, I think, we should expect to see that. But I also would say that, I'd be surprised if once all the votes are cast and counted, if, Texas isn't kind of where it normally is. We should still see record turnout. We should still see
relative to other states.
Yeah, relative to other states. We should still see record turnout in Texas. We should still see, high record turnout for Texas. But I wouldn't be surprised if we were still in the bottom tier of states when it comes to turnout. That's just a guess.
Okay, everybody, you heard that. You can vilify Josh if that turns out to be wrong.
Oh.
For not having faith in the people of Texas.
Well, no, I'm not having faith in the people who don't understand that Texas doesn't react to elections independent from everybody else.
I think there is something interesting when people call, and I think a couple of cycles ago, dined out on the line of, Texas is still part of the United States.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes one gets the impression that people think Texas is in its own tucked away in its own corner of the multiverse and not connected to the other trends. And I think, that's also frankly going to make, diagnosing what's going on in Texas when this election is over, tricky because, say there is a national Democratic landslide, well, then Texas is going to be part of that larger macro level dynamic. And say in that, I don't even want to broach the issue of, whether Joe Biden wins Texas or doesn't win Texas. I'll just say Joe Biden wins by a large margin nationally, both in the popular vote and in the electoral college. Takes Texas, doesn't take Texas, doesn't really matter for what I'm going to talk about, I don't think. We're still going to go into 2021 and 2022, and in particular the 2022 election cycle. And yes, we're talking about the 2022 election. We go into that in Texas in a situation in which you have a bunch of Texas statewide incumbent Republicans who still have dominance. And then at that point, we'll have a certain amount of structural dynamic in their favor in terms of what we know about the history of how the out of the White House parties do in the following midterm election. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, I think to me, that's one of the biggest qualifiers when somebody says, well, so, if if the Democrats take the state house and they flip another 2 to 5 or 6 or 7 or however many, seats they wind up flipping in Congress. And I do think that there will be net gains in both chambers. Will you finally admit that Texas is turning blue?
No.
I'm like, no.
No.
In fact, no.
No.
And, that's why I think, settle for being more competitive, guys.
Yeah,
and I don't mean that. Look, if you're a Democrat, it's your job to win elections. It's your job to turn Texas blue. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about from an analytical position or from an interpretive position, the state is already more competitive. If the state being more competitive is your criteria for turning blue, well, then okay. But I think that doesn't make any sense. And I think that embedded implication is often there. Or, pick your code word. Is Texas turning blue? Is it a swing state? Is it in play? Is it, all of those nuances? I feel like we need a glossary to clarify those and then try to enforce consistent usage among everyone.
I agree. I mean, I've had the
and I'm semi-joking, but I'm also,
No, because it's ridiculous, because we do this all the time. And every election cycle, I think we probably each receive somewhere between, 10 and 1,000 calls that begin with, so is Texas turning blue this year? And it's like, it doesn't work that way. It's
and I get it too.
And I say the same thing as you, which is, no, I don't think we're going to wake up on, November 4th and say, whoa, Texas is blue. I think we're going to say, hey, it turned out that Texas is competitive, which is what it looked like.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk about
less dramatic. It's hard to sell your editors on that.
Yeah. Can we talk about polling?
I get it. And again, I also want to give our reporter friends some slack, having kind of been jokey about them. That, and for those of you going, oh, come on, dude, I realize that is a ploy at times to elicit a response, and we're all.
I'm only talking about national outlets. I'm not talking about any Texas reporters.
Right. Our friends.
Can we talk about polling for a second, you think?
Just for a second. We're now over 30 minutes.
I think I can do it in less than 25 more minutes.
Yeah, probably.
Probably. All right, real quick. I'll do this. Real quick.
Go ahead.
You pointed this
I'll make
out,
some kind of face or something.
A bunch of polls came out, really in the last few days, and they've ranged, they all kind of covered the same time period, and they range from, Trump being up by, a little more than 5 points to Biden being up as many as 7 points if you go back a little ways. But, more like, let's say, Biden, up a couple points here or there. So a range of basically Trump +5 to Biden +5, more or less, all within the last, week or two of polling. And, that might leave a lot of people saying, well,
polling
let's say
sucks.
That's a nicer way of saying what I was going to say. But yes.
Yeah.
And the main thing here is I think it's all these things that we've been talking about, right? If you think about the fact of, we're in an election now where, and I brought this up, I think, last week, but after the 2018 cycle, the parlor game that was going on Twitter was, hey, in 2020, are we going to have more than 10 million voters? Now the question is, are we going to have 11 million or are we going to have 12 million? And that's kind of what the people who try to estimate these things are saying at this point. So this is, a huge turnout election. Ultimately, most of these polls that are trying to come up with, these trial ballot results, how much of the vote share Biden has, how much of the vote share Trump has, have to make some sort of a guess about what the voting electorate looks like. And you know what? That's really hard. And it's really, really hard when you're seeing, millions more voters than you've ever seen. So we go back to some of these groups. I'll use Hispanics, I think, is the best example here of the groups that we've talked about, right? Here's a group that, as we said, historically has, supported Republican candidates anywhere from, with 30% of their vote to, as high as maybe 45% of their vote. But the assumption has always been that that these are going to be more conservative, older Hispanics potentially, and that, this is a low turnout group, which means that they vote at lower rates than their share of the population. Whites vote at higher rates than their share of the population, so they're more represented in the electorate. But this is a big question. And this was, and it's funny because when I started doing this with you, like 10 years ago, people were always on this. They, you'd put out a trial ballot and say, and someone would hit a table and say, what share of your sample is Hispanic? And they really wanted to know, is it plausible? Is it too low? Is it too high? And again, now compared to what, I don't know. But this was sort of something that we would do a lot. This cycle, I don't think anybody seems to care for some reason about this anymore. But I mean, this makes a difference. I mean, and it makes a difference in two ways. Oh, you're thinking, I'll get out soon. One.
No. I want to interject and say, oh, people care. Maybe,
well,
we're not hearing. We have not heard as directly about it.
Yeah.
As we have in the past. Yeah.
Fair enough. But I mean, the thing is if you're thinking about, you're conducting a poll and you're trying to estimate the vote, the preference of the voting electorate, does it matter if your electorate is 17% Hispanic versus 25% Hispanic? Well, yeah, of course it does. But we don't know. And so there's two things going on here. One, we don't know what the composition of the electorate is going to look like based on age and based on race and based on both of those things together, number one. And number two, we really don't know what effect it has when you bring in a ton more people into the electorate than you've ever seen. Ultimately, so what I'd say is right now, based on what I know, I'd say, Hispanics are a group that goes 30 to 45% Democratic when they make up 17 to 22% of the electorate.
Republican.
I'm Republican, sorry.
Yeah.
When they make up 17 to 22% of the electorate. But what if they do make up 25, 26, 28% of the electorate this time because turnout's so high? What are the additional, if you think about the additional, 6% of the electorate that comes in who are Hispanic, do they look like the rest of the Hispanics who were voting before and were, again, a Democratic group, but not overwhelmingly? Or are you bringing in young Hispanics who lean more Democratic and now all of a sudden the Republican vote share is at 28%, or it's at that low mark of 30%, and Democrats are getting 65, 70%.
Yeah, or even below the historic low mark, or what we think is this.
Whatever. Yeah. And so, and the answer to that question is, I don't know. And the other answer to that question is, nobody knows. Nobody knows. And that's the thing. So when you see, four polling results come out that say, that basically show different results, one of the things you can do is you can go and look into the results and say, well, what was the vote share among Hispanics? And what you'll see different vote share breakdowns amongst Hispanics, right?
And so a lot of variance among the different results. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, not to get out and I'll get out of this point, and maybe you'll come back to it or maybe we'll just end it. But I mean, the other piece to this, I think that's important to remember is, polling results are estimates. And when you're trying to estimate a race that appears to be, 50-50, 51-49, 52-48, even really up to like 55-45, you're talking about a close race. It's not easy. It's not easy to say this person's definitely going to get 51% of the vote and this person's definitely going to get 49% of the vote. It just doesn't really work that way. And I think that's something that, I think people also have to kind of get a hold on, which is that we have a very fluid and I would say a very fluid and dynamic electorate in Texas, and more so over the last two cycles. So it's not as easy as, it's easy for someone like Beto O'Rourke to say, well, you're not getting the right people. And I would say, who are the right people? I don't know. And I don't think that anybody really does until we get through this election cycle and we see what the electorate actually looks like.
I think more importantly, who are the right people and how do you know? Because he'll have a very ready answer for who the right people are.
Right. The how do you know is the
how do you know, I think, is the main thing. And we got to close it out. But I mean, what I would say is, and it's something I think, you put succinctly, at one point in an earlier podcast, which is, we're talking, I think we typically focus on one estimate when we have these questions, when we get these questions about, well, what was the breakdown of your sample, right? And that's always an estimate, right? But it's an estimate of an estimate. It's an estimate that then feeds into another estimate, which is our estimate of the underlying population. Right. And sometimes a lot about the underlying population that you're trying to sample.
Ideally. And
in this case, we don't.
Right.
Right. And so, the uncertainty baked into this is always there. And we always try to talk about it. And I think, it's incumbent on us to talk about it in more depth, but also more clearly to people. And that was one of the takeaways of 2016. Right. And, I think, the overall failure to talk about how this exercise works in terms of polling, but also more broadly how modeling worked. And we don't want to get into that. And at some more metaphysical level, what probability is got us into a lot of trouble in 2016 that we're still paying for. Because multiple debriefs, multiple analyses, hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of discussion later, we both still get calls going, so let's start with why 2016 all the polling was wrong.
Yep.
Yep.
Can you hear my sigh?
And that sigh was audible. And on that note, thanks a lot for listening and for staying for the extra bit. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks, as always, to our terrific production staff in the College of Liberal Arts and the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. And thanks again to you for listening. I suspect if you're listening, you probably already have, but if you haven't, get on out there and vote. And we will talk to you next week. And the next time we all talk, we'll know a lot more, but have probably a whole new set of questions. Thanks for listening to the Second Reading Podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.